Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
I don't know how today's topic got on my list.
Yeah, I asked you this, and you were like, I don't know.
I don't know how it did, and I will confess to you, it's a bear. Like, it was a bear to research. It's a bear to sort out all the stuff, because it's a lot of, like, proto-England things going on where stuff goes by 7 different names.
Yep.
So you got to try to pick one and run with it and hope that you've chosen correctly. It's like the cup of a carpenter in history form.
Yeah.
But we're talking about the Battle of Brunanburh, and first of all, it's an Old English poem that appears in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, but that poem tells the story of an actual battle that took place in 937. It is often referred to as the battle that made England. There are so many questions about this battle, including how it played out and where it took place. Those questions and the debates about theories to answer them have become their own interesting story. We're going to talk about that near the end of the episode. It is quite fascinating. We'll talk a little bit, too, in behind the scenes about the claims that this one was forgotten and what that really means. But we're going to tackle the Battle of Brunanburh and hopefully get most of the details right.
When the Battle of Brunanburh took place, there were multiple groups jockeying for control of what is now northern England, with multiple different kings involved. And then this is further complicated by the fact that within these groups were subgroups made up of alliances as people tried to strengthen their forces. Even who these subgroups are also complicated because we have the Anglo-Saxons, of course. That is why the whole thing is relayed in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Just that term, though,
has its own problems.
Yeah, the term Anglo-Saxon can incorporate a lot of different Germanic peoples that all came to Britain. This was at a time that just a group of cultures were all operating under one umbrella and one ruler. And then there was just a whole bunch of other people who were united against the Anglo-Saxons. There's a lot of history that leads up to this battle. We're going to start centuries earlier to try to give a broad overview of how things progressed. This is kind of the same thing that I ran into with Eustace the Monk, where I needed to go one step earlier and earlier to get a full sense of how things developed.
Yeah, and this is obviously going to be a very, what I like to call a quick and dirty version of this history. So prior to the 5th century, there were Roman forces controlling Britain, although there were non-Roman people who lived there. Those are typically called the Gales, Picts, and Britons. But the Romans left in the early 400s, and that created a power vacuum that other groups rushed in to fill, often through violent conquest. So the Angles, Jutes, and Saxons were the major players in this move westward from the European continent to gain a foothold in the area of the British Isles.
This resulted in multiple kingdoms being established on the island of Great Britain. Wessex in the south, Mercia in the central part of the island called the Midlands, East Anglia to the east, and Northumbria to the north of Mercia. This was really not a peaceful arrangement, and the borders of all these kingdoms were frequently in a state of conflict, particularly the border that separated Mercia from Northumbria. In Northumbria was York, which was considered a key location for any power that wanted to control the northern part of the island. By the 8th and 9th centuries, there were even more groups arriving in Britain, hoping to capitalize on the available resources there and claim land for themselves.
And all of these disparate groups were not only divided by their desires for power and wealth. There was also a spiritual ideology split among them that made any efforts at international relations really fraught by judgment. So while the Saxons were largely Christian by this point, some of the cultures in play were pagan, and the Saxons had come to view paganism as backwards and kind of a primitive way of life. Initially, all of this bad relationship went very badly for the Saxons, and their lands and their numbers were diminished under the leadership of King Alfred the Great. And then as Danish forces advanced on Alfred and the Saxon footprint grew quite small as they receded into the west with only Wessex remaining. But then by the late 9th century, Alfred was able to kind of put together an army and push back a little bit, and he made some ground back. Alfred was also pretty good at establishing allyships and managing diplomatic efforts. He understood he did not necessarily have the manpower or the foothold. So while he was not able to regain all of the Saxon holdings he had once had, he did manage to bring a degree of stability to the area before his death in 899. Alfred, by the way, is pretty interesting. He might be an episode on his own at some point. But germane to this story, Alfred's son, Edward the Elder, was next on the throne, and he ruled until 924. He was able to further expand the Saxon lands again. And there was, amidst all of this, definitely a generational familial goal to get all of the Saxon kingdoms together, united under one king who would be a descendant of Alfred.
As the Saxons were gaining ground, though, in the 800s, there were also Norse invaders taking coastal lands in northern Britain and Ireland. Those territories would come under the rule of the Earls of Northumberland, Norse earls of Viking descent. By the time of the battle we're talking about today, they were ruled by Anlaf Guthrason. Scotland, which at the time was known as the Kingdom of Alba, was also consolidating its power as the various groups there had come together for their mutual benefit. King Constantine II was ruler of Scotland, and Strathclyde, which sat just south of Scotland in the lowlands, was ruled by Owen. The boundaries of all of these kingdoms and the fiefs within them, as well as the Anglo-Saxon lands, were just in a state of almost continuous flux. Everybody wanted to become the dominant power.
Yeah, there was just constant pushing of boundaries, literally, of like, but if I just take over some more of this land, I will expand my power. So Aethelstan of Wessex, who was the grandson of Alfred, ascended to the Anglo-Saxon throne in 925, becoming ruler of Wessex, Mercia, and East Anglia. He was born sometime in the 890s, and he had been raised in Mercia by his aunt Aethelflaed. She had the title of Lady of the Mercians, and she had ruled there and was a very active participant in the fighting to gain and retain land and power. Sometimes she and Edward are talked about almost as like a duo at this time, her brother Edward being the person on the throne after Alfred. So all of this is to say, it was not as though Aethelstan had been raised away from the persistent conflict that just automatically came with being part of the ruling family. Aethelflaed, his aunt who raised him, died in 918, after Aethelstan had reached adulthood.
By the time he became king at the age of 30, Aethelstan was keenly aware that he had to be firm in that role to deal with the constant challengers to his power from both without and within. At one point, claims that he was an illegitimate claimant to the throne led to an unsuccessful plot by another noble to try to blind him. Within his kingdom, though, he appears to have been a pretty even-handed ruler. He made just laws, for example. They were intended to provide material care for the poor, to handle juveniles involved in crimes in ways that recognized their youth and didn't treat them as adults when they were being sentenced. Although he had detractors in the corridors of power, in the first decade of his rule, he won the loyalty of the people.
And early in his reign, Aethelstan invaded York, which was held by Vikings at the time. And this was to prevent the Vikings from moving any farther into Anglo-Saxon territory. But it also sent a very clear message that Aethelstan was ready, willing, and able to engage in military conflict to protect and expand his kingdom. He further consolidated the groups that had been united under Alfred and Edward, developing the Kingdom of Angleland. And to make all of this work, he had all of the leaders of the smaller kingdoms and fiefs under him swear their loyalty to him on paper.
Coming up, we'll talk about all the suspicion and intrigue that ultimately led to the Battle of Brunanburh. First, we will pause, though, for a sponsor break.
The entirety of the British Isles during this time has been described as pretty messy by various historians. And that's accurate. There were so many men and various icons of power angling for position. Each island was fractured by various factions in some way. And Aethelstan was pretty open about wanting to unite all of these varying kingdoms of Britain under his rule. So the other leaders who were in the picture always suspected that he might invade, even if there were agreements or treaties in place. And that made them reluctant to abide by any such agreements. And that's kind of how things next escalated. Aethelstan invaded Scotland and Strathclyde in 934, following a broken pledge made by the rulers of those countries to be loyal to Aethelstan and not befriend the Norsemen. Probably. Again, this history is open to a bit of interpretation due to the sparse and disparate accounts. But Constantine is said in one account to have married his daughter off to Anlaf Guthfrithson. So if that was the case, there was clearly an effort being made to develop a relationship between those two kingdoms. And Constantine paid a steep price when it came to angering the Anglo-Saxons with this move. The year after Aethelstan launched this invasion, Constantine too ended up swearing allegiance to Aethelstan, as did Owen of Strathclyde, having both surrendered to the Saxon forces.
There is another angle on this that really shows what a tangled situation was happening. At the very beginning of Aethelstan's reign, he had married his sister off to an Irish-Norse king, Sihtric, trying to work out his own agreement. But he was really not okay with other people trying to do the same thing after he decided the Norse were his enemies. This shift happened after Sihtric died and Guthfrith of Ivar, his brother, took the Northumbrian throne. Aethelstan did not want to make an alliance or an agreement with Guthfrith, although the specifics of exactly why are really unknown. So that then transferred onto his successor, Anlaf Guthfrithson. All this does pretty clearly evidence the fact that Aethelstan was making his decisions based on what would protect and expand his own kingdom, though.
So that allegiance with Constantine and Owen that he made them swear after he invaded only lasted a couple of years because everyone knew that Aethelstan was going to be unstoppable if he went unchallenged. So in 937, Constantine and Owen, who were related, formed an alliance with Anlaf Guthfrithson, who ruled Viking Northumbria and Dublin at the time. As an aside, we've been calling him Anlaf, but you will sometimes see his first name listed as Olaf instead of Anlaf, just if you are looking online, that's the same person. And the plan of this little group was to take on Aethelstan, regain their power and land, and seize parts of England for themselves. They also just wanted to stop Aethelstan in his tracks because they knew he was a very real threat to their own kingdoms. So at this point, all of these different power players had formed up into two groups. Aethelstan, leader of the Anglo-Saxons, and everybody else who wanted to take him down.
The alert that there was a Viking invasion fleet on the Ireland-facing coast went out in August of 937. This is recorded in John of Worcester's account, Chronicle of Chronicles, as, quote, Anlaf, the pagan king of the Irish and many other islands, incited by his father-in-law Constantine, king of the Scots, entered the mouth of the river Humber with a strong fleet. But this account is one that was written in the 12th century, almost 200 years after this whole thing actually happened, so it's not necessarily a reliable source.
Yeah, there is a lot of discussion among historians of John of Worcester's account, which in many cases has kind of been taken at face value, but that may have caused some confusion to the historical record. But regardless, Aethelstan is said to have been a little bit slow in responding to this news of an army of newly allied forces landing on Saxon territory. And this has been interpreted in a number of different ways. While it obviously would seem at first glance like this was just the result of being taken unawares by the attack, some historians have put forth the idea that this was also a strategic psychological move on Aethelstan's part, as he wanted his enemies to believe he was taking his time to amass a huge response force.
And this is where we get to the Battle of Brunanburh. although at the time, people just called it the Great Battle. The battle itself is believed to have happened on a piece of land that the various parties all agreed to, but we do not know where that piece of land was. There have been a lot of theories over the years, and many historians have pieced together as much information as they can, sifted through clues in the epic poem to try to triangulate which places seem like the most likely possibilities. This will probably not be conclusively known unless some major archaeological find happens, but people are compelled to just keep looking because this was such a decisive battle, and we will get to some of those theories about where it might have been in a bit.
We also mentioned at the top of the show that the very nature of the battle, meaning the style in which it was fought, has also been debated over the centuries. So one possibility, and kind of the most popular, was that they engaged using the shield wall approach, meaning that each side would assemble, as the name suggests, in a formation so that their shields formed a wall that the approaching opponent would have to breach to strike. Meanwhile, any attacking side would form a similar wall, but instead of holding stationary, they would be on the move, pushing forward. And then this would become a very close combat situation where each side would be trying to find the gaps at the bottom or the tops of the shields or in between shields as men shifted so that they could stab a spear or sword through. It is a lot of pushing back and forth. If you ever watch historical reenactments of this, to me, it looks utterly miserable and terrifying. Because it's like being trapped in a space with people trying to stab you while you are also trying to stab them, and nobody can really see clearly what's going on. This is the most commonly accepted take on how this conflict was fought, largely because it's how it was described in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle.
The battle itself is described in the first 3 stanzas of that poem, which are these. In this year, King Aethelstan, Lord of Earls, ring-giver of warriors, and his brother as well, Edmund Atheling, achieved everlasting glory in battle with the edges of swords near Brunanburh. They cleaved the massed shields, hewed the battle wood, the relics of hammers of the heir of Edward as it suited their heritage, so that they often in battle defended their lands, treasures, and homesteads against every one of the hateful. Foemen were felled, the Scottish people, the ship's sailors fated were destroyed, the fields grew slickened with the blood of men after the sun passed upwards over the earth. In the morning time, the remarkable star, the bright candle of God, the eternal Lord, until that noble creation sank to its rest. There lay many warriors, seized by the spear, the northern men over their arrowed shields. Likewise, the Scottish also were weary, saddened by war. The West Saxons in their ranks rode down the long, long day, the hateful people, chopping down the battle fleers from behind, so sorely with sharply ground swords.
Bless you, Tracy, for reading that. That is only a small part. It is like a 73-line poem, so it's not like massive and epic, but it's long. And as described in those stanzas, Aethelstan's forces were ultimately successful. They were able to find those gaps between shields and had the stamina to keep pushing through an entire day of battle. Once the shield wall of the invading forces was really breached by Aethelstan's army, Constantine II and Anlaf's armies scattered in a chaos, and their respective leaders returned home. In the end, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle narrative, 5 kings, 7 earls, and an army too large to count had all been killed.
After the battle, Aethelstan proclaimed himself the king of all Britain, Rex Totius Britanniae, even though this had not resulted in all the kingdoms of the British Isles being brought together. So while by some accounting it was technically a victory for Aethelstan, it had also depleted his resources so much that he could not even think about expanding the kingdom any further. He only lived a couple of more years, though, so even if he hadn't exhausted his possibilities in the Battle of Brunanburh, he still probably wouldn't have been able to do a whole lot in terms of military rallying and land expansion. He died on October 27th, 939.
We're going to pause here to hear from the sponsors that keep Stuff You Missed in History class going. And when we come back, we're going to talk about all of the efforts to figure out the details and location of Brunanburh and how historians have been in heated debate about it for quite a while. This battle is referenced and talked about in dozens of texts from the era and after it, but they still give us precious little detail. And the details that do exist often contradict one another from narrative to narrative. The name Brunanburh is even given differently in various sources. I think there's something like 9 different names given for this field of battle. But this isn't the only difference in accounts of the battle, which is part of why there are a lot of ideas about where it happened and how. And while the battle is usually noted as having happened in the autumn of 937, some writings place it in the summer. This seems to be because it's like that August, September, October time, which, even today people will call different seasons. There's also the possibility that the shield wall form of battlefield engagement may not have been used. It may have involved a cavalry charge. That's not proven, though. And it might have involved trench warfare. For example, the Norse army is said to have dug trenches and reinforced them with timber as part of their preparation for this conflict. But that doesn't come up in all of the accounts. So many, many questions surround this battle, even though it is considered incredibly important and decisive in forming the boundaries of the countries in the British Isles as we know them today.
The main thing most people would like to know, more than how the battle played out, is where the heck it happened. And there have been more than 36 possible places that have been put forth as possibilities. We will not go over all of them, but we will talk about a couple of the most popular and most hotly debated of them. One of the big problems, of course, is that the place names have changed, but another problem relates to our recent episode on the Domesday Book. There wasn't a comprehensive survey of England until William the Conqueror had one done and turned it into usable data in 1086. That was almost 150 years after this battle happened.
Yeah, places had names and there were some documentations, but in terms of just comprehensively making a list and surveying everything and laying it out, there really wasn't. In 2022, Paul Cavill of the University of Nottingham published a paper detailing what he called the Yorkshire hypothesis. And this paper is actually a rebuttal to the work of Aethelstan historian Michael Wood, who wrote several articles about it starting in 1980, including the 2013 article Searching for Brunanburh, the Yorkshire Context of the Great War of 937. And all of Wood's work suggests that Yorkshire is the location of Brunanburh. Cavill's paper deconstructs Wood's work point by point, noting, quote, "The propositions of Wood's argument are not easily reduced to simple terms that can be enumerated, but for clarity, that is here attempted." So then he goes through all of these. And one such point made by Cavill plays out as follows, quote, "The prima facie argument for a Yorkshire site of the battle depends very substantially on the account that records the Hiberno-Norse forces landing in the Humber, originating in John of Worcester's Chronicle. There are many reasons why John of Worcester's Humber entry account of Brunanburh is suspect. It is, for example, just one theory of many advanced by early writers as to where the battle might have taken place, but given much more prominence than any of these, partly because John was an influential historian and his work was used by others. In addition, it has been shown that the formulaic features of John's writing might suggest that he resorted to assumption based on parallels elsewhere in his history to fill a puzzling gap in his and others' knowledge." That's that problem I mentioned earlier, that the John of Worcester account a lot of people have run with, and now there are a lot more people going, yeah, but why did we assume he was accurate? Over time, that Yorkshire hypothesis, which for a while had a lot of support, has kind of fallen out of favor.
The most supported theory today places the location of the battle on the Wirral Peninsula in northwest England, and specifically near the town of Brunanburh in Cheshire County. This peninsula is bounded by the Liverpool Bay to the north, Dee Estuary on the west, and Mersey Estuary on the east side. This is a location that would have been accessible for troops approaching England by sea from both Ireland and Scotland. This location being the likely site of the battle got some support in recent years from archaeological finds of weapon remnants. That effort was headed up by a volunteer project called Wirral Archaeology, which has collected a wide range of objects on the peninsula from a span of time. According to their website, they've collected, quote, artifacts spanning over 2 millennium, which includes objects from the early medieval period and a great deal of iron.
The Wirral Archaeology site says of their project, quote, "We know that locating ancient battlefields is an extremely challenging enterprise, and we also acknowledge that this will be a long-term endeavor and that it will take many years to collect and identify material before any assessment or judgment can be made. But we believe that we have all the physical and topographical features present, combined with a reliable theoretical assessment of the political landscape of the period and logistical issues that would have been overcome."
This line of thinking has also been included in the work of historian Michael Livingston, who wrote the books The Battle of Brunanburh, a Casebook, and Never Greater Slaughter, Brunanburh and the Birth of England. In both of these books, though through different approaches, Livingston makes the case for the Wirral location. Livingston lays out details from all of the texts that reference the battle to note the parallels in topography to existing places. This is something that others have done as well and ended up coming to different conclusions. As Livingston himself wrote of the situation, quote, "No map, medieval or modern, has a place clearly marked Brunanburh on it, much less the other clues our sources give us about the battle. As a result, people have been free to theorize its location almost anywhere in Britain, and they have."
Livingston also breaks down how the search methods for finding Brunanburh have kind of fallen into two groups. The people who work with a theory about what the campaign's target was to determine the most likely site, and then the people who try to work from noted place names in narrative accounts to try to match them up with existing places or features of the landscape, and then figure out what the goal of the whole thing was. Livingston is very open that he is in the latter group, and through his work analyzing the various available texts, he comes up with a checklist of attributes that the Brunanburh site needed to have, including that it needed to be on the west coast of Britain, it needed to be near an uncultivated field, and that it needed to be near a river that had a water crossing. There are other items on the checklist. One of them is that it has to be near some sort of hill, because Brun, my understanding is a reference usually to a hill. So it's like saying Brunanburh is like saying a burrow near a hill. Livingston ties all of the items on his checklist back to specific details in various narrative accounts, and usually ones that can kind of be verified by crossover information from other ones. And his conclusion through all of this is that it was on the Wirral, with the archaeological finds there as supporting evidence.
Although these papers we've been talking about that hash out the whereabouts of the site are recent, this discussion and sometimes argument has been going on for a very long time. Though there are often mentions of the Battle of Brunanburh being forgotten for a while, the battle of where it happened has been active in newspapers at least since the mid-1800s.
One article appearing in the Preston Chronicle and Lancashire Advertiser in 1856 under the heading, "Where was the Battle of Brunanburh fought?" opens with a plea to the paper's editor by a man named Charles Hardwick. And it says, quote, "Sir, I was somewhat surprised to perceive in your last paper a letter signed by a subscriber to the forthcoming History of Preston, in which the writer takes exception to my announcement at the dinner of the Historic Society that I had concluded, after much investigation, that the Battle of Brunanburh might have been fought in this neighborhood. As I consider a newspaper scarcely the proper medium for the discussion of such a question, I should have declined replying to your correspondent and left my evidences to exert what influence they might upon public opinion, but that an erroneous impression as to my motive might have resulted from such a course. I conceive it would be logically sufficient for me to request that my position may be judged upon after I have published my reasons. I will, however, believing your correspondent's advice to be both courteous, and sincere for his satisfaction, inform him that I am perfectly aware of the difficulties he mentions and likewise of the discrepancies to which he alludes. He is wrong, however, in supposing the site is at all positively determined upon by any authority. The most probable hypothesis at present rests upon the merest conjectures.
And Brunanburh on the Wirral Peninsula is not a new contender in these arguments either. In 1937, a woman named Anne Anderson, identifying herself as the Honorable Secretary of the Brunanburh Society, wrote a letter to the Liverpool Daily Post that makes it sound as though that group was operating on the belief that Brunanburh was the spot. Anderson has, it appears, written to the paper before with this information, and that letter got a great deal of response. So Anne writes, quote, "It may interest your readers to hear my line of argument." She makes several points. One, that there was probably just one Brunanburh in 937, quote, "just as there is but one Brunanburh today." Two, that the Dee and the Mersey, which bound the Wirral, have long been embarkation and debarkation points to and from Ireland. Three, that there is a German map from 1880 that places Brunanburh on the Wirral, right about where Brunanburh is. And four, that if you work through the logistics of how an invasion from the forces involved had to work, they probably met on the Isle of Man and then made their way over, and that made the Wirral the most logical place.
Anne Anderson would have likely loved the archaeological work that has gone on in recent years in the area. But even today, there are still plenty of detractors that feel that the evidence at hand is not enough for certainty. It may remain a history mystery forever, but in the meantime, people will keep digging literally and figuratively. I yearn for a moment when there's an unearthed where it's like, no, it's inscribed and it says, "This spear made for the Battle of Brunanburh."
Yep.
That's probably not going to happen. But in the meantime, I have two pieces of listener mail. The first is from our listener, Kimberly, and it's about one of my favorite topics, waffles. It also features a dog that, like, I want to steal your dog. It's the cutest and a very cute kitty as well. Kimberly writes, "Hi, Holly and Tracy. I've been thinking about sending this email for 4 years, ever since you first released your waffle episode. And since it was just the Saturday classic, it feels like my reminder to finally sit down and write. You only just mentioned at the end waffle-type foods from other countries, including Italian pizzelles. My mom's family is of Italian heritage, and we make pizzelles every year for Christmas, along with several other Italian foods. You say in the episode that pizzelles are deep-fried. While I can't speak for every recipe from every region of Italy throughout history, I have never personally known them to be made that way. We use a special iron with long handles that's placed over a burner and turned halfway through to cook both sides. It sounds a lot like the earlier version of waffle irons that you talked about, actually. The result is a patterned wafer-type cookie about 4 to 5 inches in diameter. We always just eat them like a plain cookie, but I have seen recipes that roll the pizzelle into a cone and call for a filling. Baking them is a time-consuming process as you make one at a time. Since multiple family members own pizzelle irons, we will try to get 2 of them going at once to speed up the process. My aunt bought an electric iron a few years ago and absolutely loves it. It makes more than one at a time, like a segmented waffle maker, so baking does go faster." And then Kimberly shares pictures of her pizzelle iron and her very cute dog that I kind of want to steal, who is named Luna Lovegood, and her rescued cat, Nubia Tuesday. The cat, she says, wants to be held 24/7, and we adopted the dog 4 years ago to keep her company. We specifically chose a dog who had a positive history with cats. I had visions of them snuggling up together, napping in the sun. It turns out the cat hates all other animals. Still, after 4 years, she hisses and growls every time she sees the dog. I keep hoping for a miraculous attitude change. Thanks for your time, Kimberly. Listen, you can't always predict how animals are going to react to other animals, even if they've had a history. You just never know. I love it. Thank you for sharing your pizzelle info. I fully believe that they're made in different ways by different people, as are most things. It's kind of like the way you can say you make, almost anything. Like, listen, ask how somebody makes barbecue in the US and you'll get a different answer depending on where you're at.
And people will be angry about it.
Some people will be angry. I just want to eat all the delicious stuff. How do you make it? Great. Can you make one for me? I will say, after we ran that episode as a classic, one of my good friends texted me, was like, I want to have a waffle frolic. And I was like, yeah, me too. So we'll bring it back. I'm still on it. I also wanted to answer our listener, Lance, who wrote us a short email to ask if I was going to be at DragonCon this year. Lance mentions, Holly, we plan on going to DragonCon on Sunday, September 1st. We will be going to many of the Star Wars events, but if it works out, we would like to see you as well if you are attending and available. I didn't see this until after DragonCon. I kind of did a drive-by version of DragonCon this year. We went for like a couple hours a day, and I tended to like hide out in a bar. We went to the dealer's room one day, which was almost a 2-hour wait just to get in.
Oh my
and then
goodness.
It was like, yeah, it was a little bananas. And then we just kind of did that and we were very tired. So I've been so busy lately that I haven't had like the mental or emotional energy to go see a lot of people in a crowd of people that is a big sea that's very overwhelming.
Well, and not being local to Atlanta anymore, it's not on my list of things to do. But even when I was in Atlanta, the amount that DragonCon grew between the time that I started going and the last time that I went, like it got to a point where I was like, this is too much. Too much.
Yeah, and we're definitely back to beyond pre-COVID levels. Like, you know, it, like many other things, like the travel industry had like obviously the gap where nobody was doing that and they had canceled it. And then like the post lockdown surge has just been ceaselessly growing. So it's a lot. It's still, you know, has fun. I love seeing friends and stuff, but I get a little easily overwhelmed at times. Anyway, if you would like to write to us, ask us if we'll be a place. I may or may not see it in a timely manner, but you could still try. You could do that at historypodcast@iheartradio.com, and you can also subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app or anywhere you listen to your favorite shows.
Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.